Today we're coming together to talk about the 2024 elections, America's politics at the crossroads. Welcome this evening our special guest. It is Professor Reinhard Heinisch. He's Professor for Austrian politics in a comparative perspective at the Paris Lodron University in Salzburg, Austria. Reinhard Heinisch is an example for a very interesting international transatlantic career. His first degree he finished in political science in Austria. Then he moved over to the United States. He earned a master's degree at Virginia Tech in the state of Virginia. Later on, he added to this a PhD from the Michigan State University. Afterwards, he served as a full professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the state of Pennsylvania. He also headed there the Center of European Studies. Later on in his life, he decided to return back to Austria, to the University of Salzburg, to which he was appointed as a full professor. And in that sense, Reinhard Heinisch is resembling a perfect example of combining Austrian European experience with American experience and bringing it together in a broader perspective. Shortly about my person, I'm an associate professor for comparative political science at the University of Vienna, of course, in Austria. As we all know, coming week on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024, there are going to be very important elections in the United States. On the one hand, these are congressional elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate. At the same time, also the presidential elections take place. These are the 60th presidential elections in American history, with two important key competitors. On the one hand, for the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris. On the other, for the Republican Party, Donald Trump. So in that sense now, these are being elections qualified by several observers as a key election point with possibly major implications for American domestic politics, but of course also for the international system. In that sense, to begin with, Reinhard, the big question, of course, is who is going to win? Will it be Harris or Trump? And as we all know, the predictions, the opinion polls are very, very tight. There's a certain tendency of tight opinion polls. What can be said as far as we can say from a political science perspective? Who may win or lose, or is it impossible to make here any scenarios or models? So in that sense, asking you as a political scientist, using the instruments of a modern discipline, where do we stand with these presidential elections?
So first of all, I want to thank you for having me. Secondly, I need to also say, you introduced me as a professor of Austrian politics, and I'm now talking about the United States. I should point out I'm also an American citizen, so I vote. So I have an intrinsic interest and I'm voting in a swing state in Pennsylvania. In the US, I was teaching American politics, and I'm actually a comparativist by training. So I've worked all my life on populism and democracy, and also comparatively Europe and the United States. The denomination of my position in Salzburg, it's a denomination, but I tend to think of myself as someone working comparatively. And the Trump phenomenon, Donald Trump has been a factor ever since I lived in Pennsylvania. I would say parts of Pennsylvania were Trumpian before there was Trump. So there's an interesting connection. And also, I do think that what we see in the US is in many ways also related to what we see in Europe. I don't think the phenomenon itself and the underlying causes are all that different. So before I go into probably a very political science explanation, let me just answer your questions outright. I would answer that way. I would be more surprised if Harris wins it than if Trump wins it. I do expect that Trump in the end will win. But this is simply a gut feeling, or sort of reading the tea leaves, and the tea leaves seem to be falling into place in a certain ways. And you could look at the prediction market, the betting market. The betting market has Trump ahead. You can look at polling data in the swing states, where Trump seems to be slightly ahead, although within the statistical margin of error. It's they're also, it's very close. There are a lot of models to predict Harris to win. I do think that this may still be a factor that we have, that people are probably more reluctant to admit that they vote for Trump than they vote for Harris. There may be an overestimation of Harris and an underestimation of Trump, as is often the case in populists. Although I know the comeback to this is the Democrats were predicted to lose the midterm elections, that there was supposed to be a red wave, a Republican wave, which didn't materialize. And also in 2020, Biden was surprisingly strong, or stronger than he had been predicted. So that's true. However, I think the Trump campaign has the momentum. I think several factors have fallen in place that work for him. I think it's a change election. That 2/3 of the people polled think that the economy is the main problem. They're unhappy with the economy and inflation. They blame the Biden administration for that. They think it was a failure. Trump has a clear advantage on the economy. Trump has a clear advantage on the other very salient issue, which is immigration. Harris has an advantage on the issue of abortion and reaching out to women. But it's a change elections, and themes are dominant that help Trump. And also Trump in many ways, and Harris as a candidate, well, there is a structural disadvantage. I mean, if it were so easy for women to win the presidency, more women would have become president. And if it were easy for a minority to win the presidency, more minorities would have been president. So if you add all these factors together, it suggests that it may be breaking for Trump. But if it doesn't, if Harris wins, that's still within the forecasts, and I would be more surprised, but I wouldn't find this and it's something also that's to be expected, and it's just too close. And the New York Times says, the difference, the people deciding it may fit into an American college football stadium. So we can imagine there's a few thousand people that may decide it, and that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's several prediction models out there. The one is the so-called Project 5038. In their model, in the most current status, they also by tendency lean towards predicting a victory of Trump, even though it's small, but they're predicting it. At the same time, you also have other approaches. As an example, a person like Alan Lichtman, he's a professor at the American University, who developed a model on predicting the outcome of US presidential elections. I think he calls it also like something like the 13 keys. In his model, he's more or less ignoring opinion polls, but basically saying they're actually distracting. Maybe also for our audience and our listeners, if you could perhaps a little bit summarize up what here the different rationals are, and maybe also something like a short assessment. Is it smart? Does it make sense to have an approach like Alan Lichtman to say, don't look at the opinion polls, but try to refer to other structural or dynamic factors? So what would be your assessment in this context?
Yeah, so I maybe in my own defense, I should point out that I had predicted or had suggested Trump would win the first election in 2016 on Austrian television when it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win by a landslide, and was being ridiculed by one of the television anchors. And I think I've been sort of making the case for now quite some time that I think it may break for Trump. but with all the caveats and the caution that is necessary. So when Nate Silver in the New York Times, who is sort of the architect behind the 356 model, also tended to suggest that Trump might win. I think very similarly, sort of, I do look. I'm a social science researcher. I think David, you're too. We both look at opinion data. We know there are problems. We know that models have issues. There are prediction errors. There are biases, etc., etc. So all said. But fundamentally, I think empirical data do in the end tell us a story. When, of course, it's very, very close, then there are difficulties. Another difficulty is when the factors are very new. So we have had a campaign with essentially a candidate switching on the Democratic side halfway through the campaign. We've had 2 assassination attempts. We've had so many things going on in this election. The election is so unprecedented, so that I would completely understand if the models are off by a big factor. And then in the end, it doesn't matter where the majority is. Hillary Clinton had a majority of the popular vote in 2016, 3 million more votes. It matters what ends up when it happens in the electoral college. So all these caveats said, but I do think the models, the opinion models, where you look at polling data from the states, you look at and you compare how these polling data with previous polling data, and what changes and what a certain dynamic trend in a particular state, what consequences this had if certain other factors applied. I think that gives us a better picture. Now, I'm not so much familiar with Lichtman's model. I know that the 13 keys, the 13 indicators he looks at, is there a third party? How strong is the economy? Social unrest. And he has a very good track record, and I want to dispute it. There is some serious argument. It's not simply, it's political astrology, sort of, we'll just look at the stars. But to me, the difficulty with the Lichtman model is it is sort of disconnected, in my view, from causal factors. And also, he treats these keys are all sort of on the same level. They turn it on or turn it off. And these factors would have different influences. So I would expect a model to, these factors would probably have to be weighed, and it would be more nuances. So I'm to some extent skeptical, but he had a very good prediction. I think we missed one election, but again, this is a very different election. Just looking at some of the keys, I wonder whether some of these keys would be even relevant, given that everything is off. So the Lichtman model may have worked really well as long as the overall factors were the same. But I think we are in a new state of politics, and new issues apply. And the Democrats are no longer the Democrats they used to be. The Republicans certainly are not the Republicans they used to be. So I'm just skeptical. I believe more in opinion polls and prediction markets. But we don't know. And the irony is, we assume it's going to be close. But because it is close, it could actually mean it's not close. In other words, because the popular vote in the various swing states have to translate into electoral votes. So if in several of the key states, the one candidate wins by a few votes, but it could translate into a large majority in the electoral college by, say, 100 votes. So when we say close, we mean close in terms of polling and popular vote, but it may not necessarily be close in terms of the vote in the electoral college. This is what matters. It's the candidate who first gets 270 votes, who gets 270 votes wins the presidency, and it may not be close there, depending on how the states decide.
I mean, as you've pointed out rightly, not the national popular vote is going to decide, but the counts in the electoral colleges, and they're in that sense summed up in a bottom-up approach, state by state. Now, there are about 7 or 8 so-called swing states. I think those are being paraphrased as purple states. And in a certain sense, they may be categorized into 3 clusters. So these would be the so-called Rust Belt states in the Northeast, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Then two other swing states of the so-called sunshine states would be Georgia, most importantly, perhaps to a certain degree, North Carolina. And then in the southwest, you would have Nevada and Arizona. So if you would look at these three geographical clusters of swing states, I mean, they may be interpreted as specific political ecosystems. Where do Harris and Trump, so to say, stand in these three clusters? Which of them are, in your opinion, more competitive, which may be less competitive?
Yeah, so maybe we should say, I think a lot of people who are not Americans are confused by the term swing states. Why are these states so important? What's going on in these states? What makes them different? Fundamentally, what makes them different is that these states have a tendency to go in either direction. You mentioned the purple states, so the color of the Democrats is blue, the color of the Republicans is red. If you mix them, you get purple. So these are states that either have recent history of divided government. So the House, the state legislature, one party, the governor of another party, or they vote for the president in one party and for the governor of another party, or they go back and forth. The reason is simply people in the US are dynamic. They move a lot, and we have a general tendency for people to move out of the so-called Rust Belt of the states and the north central part of the US and then the northeast, moving south. The economy is more dynamic, cost of living is lower, the climate is better, new industries are there, new universities are there, or universities expanding. So people from the north, young, dynamic, generally more liberal people are moving from the north into North Carolina, Georgia, Atlanta, and therefore make the state that used to be very conservative, often religious or the evangelical, make these states more liberal, and therefore around the big universities, around the big urban centers. And as these people are moving out in the north, the northern states become more conservative, where they used to be solid democratic states. Unions are very strong. But as people get older and young people leave, they tend to be more conservative, particularly more culturally conservative, and they feel often abandoned and neglected by the elites and by the urban centers and the coasts, and therefore becomes susceptible to messages by Trump and by his movement. Now, then there's another factor called immigration. So people are moving into some of these states, and that's particularly an issue in states like Arizona or Nevada. And so immigration cuts in a number of different ways. On one hand, immigrants tend to be more Democratic than Republican. They tend to replace some of these young liberal voters who've moved out of state, but immigrants can't be taken for granted. Some immigrants, particularly Latinos coming from Venezuela and Cuba, tend to be much more conservative, much more Republican. From Mexico, they tend to be more Democratic. And then we've seen lately that there's a split along gender lines, that women tend to vote for the Democratic. Increasingly, men are voting Republican. Not by a large margin, but by a sufficient margin, because Democrats really have to get all of them, or the largest possible share, in order to be successful. Then you have another issue is the economic composition. So if you think about Nevada, people will think of Las Vegas. So there's a lot of people in the service industry in the city of Las Vegas. And because these service workers are often also immigrants or Latinos, they would normally vote Democratic, but then Trump went in and has promised not to tax tips, and that's these are people whose income depends a great deal on tipping, on the tips they received. So there are local factors, and lastly, we shouldn't forget that on the first Tuesday in November, the Constitution mandates an election for all offices. So we're not just voting for the presidency. In fact, we're voting for, from the dog catcher, the drain commissioner, the city councils, the state legislature, sheriffs and judges and district attorneys, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of people are elected, and there are also ballot initiatives. A lot of American states, like in Switzerland, make political decisions based on ballot initiatives. So there's some very liberal ballot initiatives, particularly the abortion rights is on the ballot in Arizona. And in every ballot where this was been in every state where this was on the ballot, even in very conservative states, essentially the pro-abortion or the restoring abortion rights won, even in very conservative states, because that really speaks to women. So to prevent and counteract that, the Republicans put another ballot measure on the Arizona ballot, namely one that would allow the state police to enforce federal immigration laws. So the state police could then round up suspected immigrants and deport them. So we can see that these ballot measures are also going to play a role as they bring different kinds of constituencies to the polls. And therefore, this is also sometimes very hard to predict. Generally, I think the main weakness that Harris has, that she is a Californian, a woman of color, and associated with the current administration that has economically a pretty bad rap, and she has to win states like Pennsylvania, which are culturally quite conservative. And I don't know if an average Pennsylvanian, to what extent they can relate to someone like Miss Harris. And Harris also has the difficulty. She needs the Jewish voters in Pennsylvania as much as she needs the many Muslim and Arab voters in Michigan. And of course, there's the Gaza conflict and the role of the United States and its relation with Israel and the Palestinians that is very difficult. Whatever the government does and whatever Harris or Biden does, one of the two will be upset. And that's a really big particular problem for Harris in this sense. So she has a hard time in these northern Rust Belt states to, I think, energize her base. And I think it's easier for Trump to do that. So I'm very skeptical. And Biden did win them because Biden, as a white male and as a sort of benign father figure, was just easier for the people there, I think, to relate to than someone like Harris. On the other hand, in Arizona, immigration is a major grievance there, and people are quite split. And when it comes to North Carolina and Georgia is a state that Trump has tried to win. He failed also last time. And Georgia and Trump has a personal vendetta with the local governor, who's a Republican, and the local governor is important to generate turnout for the Republicans. But so I'm not sure. But Trump looks solid in some of the polls there, but it's not clear that these two southern states that he needs to have will definitely break for Trump. And last point, although the people tend to go back and forth, there's one other factor that we haven't mentioned. It's called gerrymandering. That is, every 10 years, the district lines are redrawn in the US and across the states after the census, because states lose votes in the electoral college and other states gain votes. So you need to, if a state like Pennsylvania used to have 21 and now it has only 19, so you need to divide up Pennsylvania divided by 19. And it's the party in power at the local level that draws the district lines. And parties have a tendency to do that, to benefit their own party and to make it more difficult for the other party. It's called gerrymandering. And that also has an effect to what extent you're able to translate your voting strength into actual seats that you then or electoral votes in the electoral college. And here too, I think the Republicans are generally slightly better at this game than the Democrats.
Well, this morning I was looking up the website of Real Clear Polling. This is a more generative website reporting about the different opinion polls. What I thought is so striking is now how many polls in that sense are somehow going into the direction of being tied or within the margin of error. Do you think is this somehow a general phenomena in so-called Western democracies that elections are becoming more and more competitive? And or is this not a specific situation for American democracy? What may tell us about the status of American democracy? And to add on here another thought. So if this really should be true, that in some of the states and also some of the swing states more particularly, it may be only a few thousand votes, or we could radicalized and say maybe just a few hundred votes, doesn't this then automatically imply it will go, so to say, into the legal arena? Yes, meaning that, well, for sure, we're not going to know who is won on November 5th. We may not even know in the days afterwards. So could there be a scenario that this time, because it is so competitive in some of the swing states, perhaps, that this may cause a whole nexus, so to say, of legal battles? And can their outcome really be predicted? In that sense, perhaps adding a certain uncertainty on how the legal system then finally may decide who has won, so to say, the presidential race this time.
Yeah, great question. So first on the surveys. I mean, you yourself are an expert on surveys, and as you well know, I mean, the times when we would, when I remember when I was as a graduate student doing my first survey, would take the phone book and look at every. I know the professor said, draw a random sample. You go every 10th page, look at every third name and phone number from the top, and you had a pretty representative sample in order to draw a sample. The days are long gone that we can simply get a random sample by looking at the phone book, and of course in the United States, even more complicated. There's no vote, there's no registration, and people don't register with the police. There's no no authoritative compilations of voters. So survey agencies, firms have to resort to models. They have ways in which they have, of course, their sample. They have a large sample of people in their overall sample, and they draw samples from that. And then they correct. They have certain biases, and then they use different mechanisms of correcting for the biases that they have in the sample. So if they oversample, so the normal sample would maybe oversample too many people's cell phones. It would undersample certain population groups of whom they have too few in their overall sample. So they have correction mechanisms, but all the models therefore have biases, and overall, the models and the surveys do a good job predicting. But if you look at Real Clear Politics, they actually show that they take a poll of polls. So they take the average of the average, because most models have consistent biases. And if you average them with the models who have different biases, the idea is you get closer to the real deal. So there's a way of getting close. But if the election is that close, such a large country, and the election is that close, there are limits to what they can do in terms of forecasting, because it will be in the margin of error, and the margin of error, even if you massively exponentially increase the sample size, it will not go away. And if you have a 2 or 3% sampling error in your model, but the difference between two parties is a lot less than that, it's just difficult to get any more accurate, number one. The other issue is, models or surveys at the national level. There are a lot of surveys at the national level, and it's much easier to draw national samples. So we have a much better sense of nationally where Americans stand on this or that issue. But the problem is, it doesn't help us. It only helps us to some extent, because it matters who is turning out, and the people need to turn out in the right districts, or in those areas that are likely going to matter, and that's big factor. So when we have fewer surveys in those different states, because there's just fewer surveys in some of these swing states. Same in Austria. If we think back of the elections in Austria, we don't have that many surveys before an election. It's not like on a daily basis that we can track that precisely. I'm sure the campaigns have some of those data, but at least they're not published as much, and therefore there's a lot more uncertainty with respect to the swing states. There's quite a few differences. On top of it, we have to remember that it doesn't matter what the vote is. Doesn't matter what ultimately the electoral college result is. So we could have a voter majority, but we could have different electoral college majority on another hand. And then we have to really say this, and I think even most Americans just don't think about this. The Constitution says, the Constitution, Article 2, where elections are defined, it doesn't specify the election of the president. The president is actually be determined by the states, and determined by the states through the process of the electoral college. So the states send a delegation to the electoral college, and then that delegation, the electoral college, takes a vote. How the states arrive at how to select the delegation, whether they have an election or some other mechanism, is up to the state. So the state can pass a law. And it's of course completely conceivable that a state would say, well, we have evidence that there are shenanigans, there's something going on in certain districts. We can't verify the vote that we have. We cannot certify the vote. So we take a decision to send a different delegation to Washington, or we can't recognize the popular vote because there's some credible evidence that something went wrong. And there are various scenarios that are possible. Like Europe, where the European elections take place in 26 states, the presidential election takes place in 50 states. The states are responsible for the elections. It's the prerogative of the state to organize the election. Voting is the state's right, and the Constitution does not prescribe the mechanism. It doesn't even prescribe a vote for the presidency. It is the states that determine the president through the electoral college, and in the electoral college, the states have a different proportion of votes depending on their size, and the states then send delegations of one party or another party to the electoral college to the vote. And there's a lot of room for problems. If you want to steer up trouble, if you can capture states or if you control a state, lots of stuff can happen. You also ask about the outcome may be close. Does it end up with the courts? I'm less concerned about the courts. I'm more concerned about the counting. Imagine there is a winner, and there is a presumed winner because on the day of the election, a candidate emerges ahead. But then the absentee ballots are trickling in, and then they start counting the absentee ballots. They made days to count all these ballots. There are massive numbers of votes to be counted. What happens if a state is counting these ballots for 3 or 4 or 5 days, and the whole fate of the country hangs on the ballot? And then you have at the same time politicians charging there's fraud going on. So that's the scenario I'm very concerned about. If we don't have a clear outcome or a presumed winner, but it's too close, there are still votes to be counted for days, and then there are claims and counterclaims about things not being right or the electoral process being fraudulent. I think that is a concern of mine.
Mm-hmm. Well, let us now focus on these two candidates more specifically. First, beginning with Kamala Harris. Could she, in your opinion, be described somehow as a liberal politician? And to which extent is she similar or dissimilar in comparison with Joe Biden and before with Barack Obama? So how would you in that sense position yourself here on these subsets of questions?
Yeah, good question. I see her very much as a centrist, and I see her as a lawyer. So if we were to ask how does she approach things, if I look at her voting behavior in Congress, she was a senator before, she to me is very lawyerly. Also, when you look at the first presidential debate, the way she dealt with Trump, where she sort of boxed him into a corner and provoked him to say things, it very much reminded me of the way of American courtroom dramas, where the prosecutor provokes the witness to get himself into trouble by saying things he doesn't want to say. And I think she tends to have a lawyerly approach. I see her as very professional, very lawyerly, bit academic. I see her in those, and I don't see her as a pressing the flesh type of politician that Biden was. Biden was in many ways a natural politician. Biden had working class roots and was able to show emotions, and he connected with people on a level that resonated. I mean, Biden had other problems. He often said things that he shouldn't have said. He got himself into trouble. But I think Biden was much better politician. And in the end, he was able to relate to voters and connect with voters that were less elite, that were working class, and it worked across racial lines as well. He was very popular with African Americans as well. So I think that was one of Biden's strengths. His problem was he was getting just too old in the end, and people were concerned about that. But I think he was a lovable and likable figure in the eyes of many Americans because of his ability to relate. I don't think she has that ability to the same extent. I think she's more brainy. I mean, she's very more reflective. She has, of course, an upbringing, went to top American schools. She has a Caribbean father, an Indian mother. Each of them were elites in their respective societies, but she did go through the civil rights experience. She could have gone to Yale, and she ended up going to Howard, to an all-black university, the premier black university in Washington. So she has an interesting history, but it's a history that is harder to relate to, I would imagine, for probably the majority of Americans. Mm-hmm. She as a Californian and someone with a different background, she is a harder sell for people in the Midwest and then, as you said, in the Rust Belt. I think she's liberal, but not too liberal. She's clearly, I don't think she's woke. She's clearly not made her race or her gender an issue in the elections. She's avoided certain mistakes that Hillary Clinton made. I mean, she didn't wear white, the color of the suffragettes, for the convention. She doesn't talk about race. She doesn't talk about that. So she's tried to steer clear of these obvious pitfalls. But, I don't think she's a person, when you ask, there's this survey, there's the questions you always ask voters, who would you rather have a beer with? I don't know if there's a lot of people in the swing states, they would say, oh yeah, I want to have a beer with her. I think people are fascinated by her. I think people have a generally positive image of her, but her other main drawback is that she is not as well defined as Trump. With Trump, you know clearly what you get, and you love him or you hate him, and he doesn't make any bones of it. With her, there is this, people say, well, I don't really know who she is or what she stands for, and maybe she waffles, she goes back and forth, or there is this. And whenever you have a person like that, the commitment or the passion or the connection is perhaps not as strong as it is that you would feel with someone like Trump, but also not the repulsion, not the rejection. But we have to remember, elections are won by turnout. That is, who turns out and who is demobilized. So Trump will probably mobilize his foot soldiers that will all show up. Whether she's able to mobilize people on the same level without having that strong connection, that's another story. It's probably more so that people will go and vote for her to reject Trump rather than actively voting for her. Mm-hmm. I mean, she's not an Obama in the sense that she was able to promise hope and change and a vision of a more unified vision of America in the future. I mean, she's been trying to do that and tries to appeal to those, but she's an extension of the Biden presidency in some ways, minus the age. And her biggest strength is that she's not Biden in terms of age and other limitations, and she's not Trump. And that's her strength. But whether it would be enough, I don't know. Policy-wise, she will certainly move away also from the Biden policy. I think Biden's probably the last European president, if we might be so glib and say that, who sort of remembers the Cold War and that kind of connection between Europe and European democracies and the United States. I think Harris comes from a state that's very much oriented towards the Pacific. The United States is increasingly oriented towards the Pacific, China. So I think there's an emotional disconnect that will get stronger no matter whether it's Harris or Trump. But she is moderately liberal, but certainly not an extreme. and not an ideologue, but rather loyally and brainy, I think, in her approach to issues and matters.
I like the wording brainy. Now, focusing on Trump, do you think Trump can be described with categories of being a right-wing populist? And again, how does Trump differ, not differ, in comparison with George W. Bush and even before with Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, so I think he is a radical right-wing populist. To me that's as clear as anything, and I'm not. I can also easily defend that position. I mean, we define populism anyone who says there are evil elites, there are good people, and there's nothing in between. You're either with the people, or the elites. The elites are all evil, drain the swamp, or the people are all good, and I understand what the people want, and I will do anything to break the power of the elites and restore sovereignty to the people, and all other interests don't matter, is a populist. I mean, that's the core definition of populism. Plus, with Trump, we have the denial of the loss of the elections, the perpetuation of every conspiracy theory under the sun, whether it is the stolen election, whether it is the great replacement, the threat of violence, the threat to prosecute his political opponents, his attitude towards free speech, his attitude towards the courts, et cetera, et cetera. And he is indicted, as he faces 81 indictments, which will probably never be we never see a trial on this. So I think the evidence is overwhelming, but it doesn't really matter. I think we're long past the point where that matters in the election. I think people have made up their mind about Trump, and they feel strongly for Trump or strongly against Trump. I think the electorate that Trump has, there's maybe 15% of core voters, then there's a certain percentage of strategic voters, and there's a percentage of conservatives who vote for Trump because they want the judges he might appoint, they like these economic policies, they think their economy or their economic interests are better taken care of. So there are a number of motives why people vote for Trump. There is the hippie who is an anti-establishment person who votes for Trump because he just doesn't like the establishment. There's the protest voter. There is the voter who thinks there's too many immigrants have come in. This is the country. We don't recognize our country anymore. There are people who are white nationals, and there are people who are America first, is saying, we need to show the world that we are number one, and we're getting, we're being bullied by everyone else, and now we have to reassert ourselves. So there are a number of different reasons why people vote for Trump, but ultimately, I think it's a reaction on the part of a lot of people who are feel threatened by a world they increasingly they less and less understand, and they look for security and protection, and they see Trump as a strong person who will keep them safe, and to the extent that Trump is strong or crazy or whatever, so we're better our crazy than someone else's crazy. So it's the strength and that he projects that is certainly the alpha male that is a big factor here. Also, people who are just don't like the current status and prefer change, radical change, vote for a change agent rather than vote for the status quo. And of course, on the economy and on some issues, Trump simply also has quite a bit of credibility. I mean, we would assume that on these issues, he'd be less constrained in doing what he thinks he will do than Kamala Harris, who would have to consider people in her own party and would have to consider media and other things. So he is certainly much more unconstrained in some areas than she is. And in some, but I think he nonetheless is a radical populist, and we don't know what he is up to. And he will be much better prepared than the first time. I would call the first time he ran as a change agent. I think now he's running as a revenge agent. He wants to take revenge of the people that have aggrieved him, and I think the country is also increasingly more polarized. but this time there are people who are willing to implement the agenda. Last time there were the so-called adults in the room. There were people who sort of meant to protect the system from Trump. And now there is a project underway, or there are people who are clearly of the same mind or have their own agenda, but clearly want to help Trump succeed, and can do a lot of damage to the democracy, and including talking publicly about preserving the majorities, fixing the system so that they would have continued majorities in the future, whatever that means. But we can infer, we can read into this, of course. These are all not exactly democratic instincts, but rather authoritarian and democratically problematic instincts that we see in these statements.
Just as a short footnote, now in comparison with George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. So is this populism of Trump, in your opinion, a new type of element in the Republican Party, or is it a continuation? How do you stand on these?
No, I think it is new. I mean, Reagan would not have a chance on the party anymore. I don't think he would be a candidate these days. The Republican Party has changed. I mean, the Republican Party was always a broad party. It was compared to a five-ring circus. But the Tea Party movement, which was a radical populist protest movement created or that sprang up as a result of the financial crisis against the elites, the Tea Party movement, remember Sarah Palin and Joe the Plumber and others, in part funded by billionaires like the Koch brothers. The Tea Party movement was sort of a populist movement that found a home in the Republican Party. There were always people like Newt Gingrich and others who were sort of, who were early benefactors of that movement, but it was contained within a larger party. And George W. Bush was, if anything, a born-again Christian, but had a clear moral compass and was different. I mean, Europeans may not have wanted to approve of him and saw him as very radical in certain ways, but he was no Donald Trump. He clearly, he's in the same Dick Cheney. If Dick Cheney, who we've often referred to as Darth Vader because he was perceived to be so radical, warns about Trump, and if George W. Bush warns about Trump, and more than 100 other Republicans, including previous people who worked for the Trump administration, signed a petition saying, we're now warning America against Trump. And these are not, these are not teenagers with an overactive imagination who just, want to sit around, sing Kumbaya. They're realistic politicians, and they are scared of Trump, and they're all card-carrying Republicans, but we have to make a distinction between, conservatives and people who, question the legitimacy of the democratic system and propose replacing aspects of it. And that coincides with rulings of the Supreme Court, that de facto implies a precedence that is above the law. If quoting the dissenting opinion to the last court ruling, Trump v. the United States, I mean, the limits of presidential powers are up in the air. We're not sure actually what the limits of presidential power are. And that, in combination with a candidate who's promised to break the mold and do things differently, that in combination is so scary. And that we have not seen that with any candidate before. Certainly not Reagan, certainly not Bush, neither of the two Bushes. It's a completely new thing. And Trump's opposing things that were created by Republicans. I mean, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, regulating business, was creation by Nixon administration. Cap and trade, dealing with global warming, was an idea of the Heritage Foundation. So, I mean, Trump is denying certain things that Republicans have pioneered, but the way Trump talks about it seems like these are liberal conspiracies or radical leftist plots, if they're in fact part of the American mainstream debate, which Trump essentially denies that ever happened and pretends the world has got very different. So it's very removed from facts. And in that sense, he is also a different candidate from previous candidates.
Now, I would like to move to the last question, but again, referring to Kamala Harris on the one hand and Trump on the other. if Kamala Harris will win the next election, what may be then certain implications for domestic politics, but of course also then for international politics?
Yeah, I think she will inherit a very difficult time because first of all, a lot of people are projecting into her, and there's a lot of expectations. And presumably she will win if she wins with a very slim majority, and then she has to please all these different constituencies and these different expectations. And I think that to her the same applies that apply to Biden. She will be much more constrained, hemmed in by the media or by the different interest groups, because as a mainstream actor you just can't act the way a radical change agent would act, who simply tosses out the rule book and does everything differently. So I think it would be very difficult for her to find a footing. Secondly, I think the Democrats may lose the Senate. It looks like the Senate is predicted to be lost. Then if you're president and have no, in the House and the Senate, Congress is governed by the other party, your agenda is dead on arrival. You have very limited option how you can get anything done. Yet voters will probably blame you. I think from a European perspective, Harris will be more sympathetic to the Ukraine and to European defense than Trump is. But also Harris understands, and her voters will say, well, but we cannot defend Europe in perpetuity. 300 million Americans cannot defend 500 million rich Europeans in perpetuity. Europe needs to do more. And sort of, Obama faced some of the same issues. So I think Harris will also, will add pressure to Europe to do more, and there will be a pivot away from Europe, by the United States, and the focus will remain squarely on Asia. However, with China, I think with Harris, we will see managed competition rather than an all-out trade war. So it may be more nuanced, and I'm sure Harris would do it in a way with allies and would be communicated in a different way. But I see her stuck domestically. I see that she would be facing massive problems, and institutions she would be extremely constrained. In terms of the overall agenda, I think there will be a continuation of the Biden agenda, but where I see her to make the biggest effort is probably on the issue of abortion. I think she's most comfortable there. Depending on how the election, let's say if somehow the Republicans and Trump had a major setback, or they blame Trump, as people are saying we could have won this easily, because my position also, if Trump weren't running, the Republicans would probably win this by 10% if they had a different candidate that has much more crossover appeal. And it might be that Harris is able then to make a deal with the Republicans on immigration. We should remember there was an immigration deal in Congress that both parties were ready to sign until Trump tweeted, "No way, we will not sign it." So there is a possibility, if people are finally done with Trump, that there's a window of opportunity after the election to do something if she can take advantage of this. But I'm generally skeptical that she will be able to do much, and I haven't seen so much. I haven't seen her to be as perhaps strategic or as visionary as Obama was, or strategic and informed as Biden was, who was able to move the needle in the background because he simply had a strong personal connection with all these, with his colleagues in the Senate in particular. But maybe I'm not doing her justice, and maybe she will grow into the role and she'll be fine, and it'll change. But I'm just a little bit more skeptical, not because I think she's not up to it. I think it's just much more difficult for someone in her position, given the odds and given the adversity that she's facing.
Now, going through the same question for Trump, his effects on domestic international politics in the light of a possible win. And here I would like to add a few issues. Now, concerning domestic politics, could there theoretically be a scenario that Trump could think of ways to bypass the principle of term limits in the sense that 2 terms and that's it. I mean, this thought, of course, also has been raised. Maybe I can have some speculations on this. And referring to the international arena, I would like you also to comment, so to say, shortly on the issues of NATO, the Ukraine, and then the Middle East. If you could share with us your thoughts on these topics in the case of a win of Donald Trump next week.
Yeah, so I mean, we're trying to psychologize Trump here.
Mhm.
So I mean, I see lots of scenarios. I think the main cap here is that he's just getting too old. I mean, in 4 years, Trump is not much younger than Biden. He's a bit younger, but in 4 years, he will be older than Biden now. And I don't think Trump enjoys policymaking very much. There's nothing that he's done that I've seen. He likes policymaking. He's often supremely ill-informed about policy. I think he likes power. He likes to be in the White House. He likes the trappings of power. And he has that power because, I mean, I can easily see that he will simply hand over the keys to an anointed successor, maybe J.D. Vance, but control things in the background through Twitter or through tweets, as he's been able to control his base in the House. I mean, tweets that he sends out may break and make or break members of Congress, that may make or break the standing of a vice president, and he will personally command a significant follower, devoted MAGA voters. They will remain loyal to him and will probably listen to what he has to say. So he may be hovering above it all if he's still mentally able and fit in 4 years. But I don't think he himself would want to subject himself to another election campaign if he doesn't have to. He would have won twice. He wanted to show that he can preserve his power and influence, which is, I think, he cherishes most, and he stays out of jail, which he also cherishes the most. So having accomplished this, I think he has made his mark on American history sufficiently that he will probably be contented with this, with the sort of the role of this elder and of a somehow right-wing elder statesman in the background. That's at least my sense. In terms of what he can do a lot of things. I mean, the president, particularly after the court ruling, sort of the political preference of the president is the fact of the national interest, and lots of things can be inferred. And every time you'd have to take this to the court to challenge this. On foreign policy, the president has tremendous power anyway. So their courts and Congress tends to follow the president on foreign policy issues. So Trump could certainly upend NATO, create NATO new, could divide Europe into old and new Europe, could select products of one European country to impose tariffs versus another. And then Europe will be challenged to either exercise solidarity or not exercise solidarity. And in that sense, we also know he has issues with Germany and France. He doesn't like that. He often says negative things about Germany and France. And he certainly doesn't like the European Union, sort of an abstract body of unelected official bureaucrats, a force for liberal politics in the world. There are many, Trump doesn't like the EU for many reasons. And he also is convinced that Europe has been taking advantage of the United States in a number of different ways. And he sees a reindustrialization and a protection of the American economy, almost like in a mercantile way, as a prerequisite for big power competition, also with China. If people are interested in that sort of thinking, it's not just Trump. I would recommend Lighthizer, who's going to probably maybe his trade secretary, but an influential sort of lawyer economist in the Trump team, who's written Free Trade Ain't Free, and shed some light on the thinking of how come Trump is risking a trade war in the interest of rebuilding American industry, which he sees as necessary for big power competition and to restore sort of the United States to former greatness, as he would say. So we'll probably see economic policies along those lines. We'll probably see tax cuts. We will probably see Trump messing with the Federal Reserve and the dollar. The idea is to devalue the dollar to strengthen American exports. We're probably going to see trade conflicts. I don't think Trump will trigger a war. I think Trump is actually being very much more cautious, and Trump is not beholden to principles. I mean, he's very situational and is a deal maker. But I see that the US will withdraw further to the American continent. But I think that withdrawal of the main power that sort of created order, has played a significant role in maintaining order, I think that will lead to more conflict. And I think the conflicts we see around the world is the result of the US abdicating this position, and therefore lots of actors now feel they can try to see if they can now accomplish what they hope to accomplish by settling scores with neighbors or what have you. And I think also if Trump wins, we see other right-wing populists, seeing themselves vindicated, and countries that are governed by them, like Hungary, will probably rejoice. And we see this phenomenon will be strengthened in different countries around the world, very much as it had been the case the first time Trump was elected. So in that sense, it's not great news for liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a thought on Ukraine. What the
Yes.
implication would
No,
be for
yeah. I
Ukraine?
mean, it's Trump has indicated, J.D. Vance and Trump both have said they don't care about the Ukraine. He's also said he would make peace in 24 hours. To the extent there is peace, it probably forcing the Ukraine to make massive territorial concessions. And then there's the question: what would make Putin happy? Would it completely demilitarized? Would it have to be occupied? Would Kiev be part of it, or would it just be the part that Russia already controls? So there is the open-ended question: what would ever make Putin happy? And Putin has at some point disputed that the Ukraine has any independent right of existence. It's essentially part of greater Russia. So it's not clear what Trump wants to do here. He's mentioned this a number of times, and he's disliked Zelensky from the start. We should remember, and Trump tends to hold grudges. And during the impeachment hearing, Trump had asked the U.S. ambassador to ask the Ukraine government at the time to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden, the son of his presumed rival for the presidential election. And Zelensky, the Ukraine government, refused or didn't do that. And I think for Trump, that was a massive, he did massively dislike that. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a personal grudge going back to that initial experience. Mm-hmm. Plus his interesting relationship with Putin, whatever it is, a man crush or a personal preference for autocrats, it's not clear. But he has said so many nice things and things of admiration about Putin that it's hard to argue that there is that he's not very sympathetic towards him. However, we also have to acknowledge that under Trump, the sanctions of Russia were also much more severe than under any previous government. So we have to mention both things. Mm-hmm. Trump is more complex than that.
Yes. Well, many thanks for this very interesting talk, Reinhard. Is there any final short statement you would like to provide in the sense of a closure of our talk?
Just these are the most important American elections since the Civil War, and that it's the first time many people collectively think that the U.S. could be headed down the road towards a not liberal democracy, whatever that is. And the fact that we are actually talking about this and that we have to take this possibility seriously, plus threats of violence, I think is very indicative of the times in which we live and why these are very, very important elections and very important 2 or 3 weeks that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. Well, these are very thoughtful comments. In that sense, now we have arrived at the end of our talk and debate. In that sense, many thanks to you, Professor Reinhard Heinisch, for having shared your thoughts and visions and expertise with us. Many thanks to the audience for having listened and followed us during the course of the last 60 minutes plus. In that sense, we wish to our listeners from Austria and Europe a nice evening, and to our listeners from the US, we wish you a nice morning or a nice noon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye bye.